Hello, everyone. Very happy that we could all be together this evening for our meeting of the Higher Purpose Forum in our series on justice and economic democracy, which is a major commitment by Higher Purpose Forum. And thanks everyone for participating in this. Both we are happy to have you as our audience, but also as participants during our discussion period. As you probably know, these Higher Purpose Forum meetings are co-hosted. We're very honored that they're co-hosted with the HJ International Graduate School of Peace for Peace and Public Leadership. And to welcome you from HJI, I'd like to introduce Dean Stephen Boyd.
Thank you very much, Jim, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here again this evening. I really want to congratulate Higher Purpose Forum and Jim Edgerly for doing really an amazing job of putting together some very interesting topics with some very qualified speakers. So on behalf of HJI as Dean of Enrollment Management, I'm really pleased to welcome you, and we look forward to a great presentation and a wonderful discussion period. As Dean of Enrollment Management, my role is to help students, potential students, understand about our programs of study. So I will be putting my contact information in the chat box later on with some important links about our degree programs and our online application if you're interested. If you do have any questions, just feel free to follow up with me at any time. So thank you again for coming. We look forward to a great evening, and I'll turn it back to you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to just put my own endorsement in for HJI. I'm a student at HJI, a doctoral candidate, and I'm now in my fifth semester, I believe, and it's been really quite an experience. The quality of the curriculum and the faculty has been awesome, and I've spent plenty of time in graduate school, so I think I know how to differentiate between excellent and mediocre content, and I've been very grateful to be part of the student body at HJI. All right, let's begin our program. So again, welcome to our June 6th presentation and discussion meeting of the Higher Purpose Forum. We'll be proceeding for 90 minutes here, ending by 8:30. Today's talk is titled Understanding the Catholic View on Social Justice. And our presenter is a real expert on this important subject, Michael Greaney. Michael Greaney is a CPA, but we know him as the Director of Research for the Center for Economic and Social Justice, which has been actually a friend of the unification movement for 20 years at least. He's CESJ is a sort of fellow traveler with our social efforts, and we're actually going to be participating with CESJ at the Braver Angels Conference at the end of this month for 3 days, where we're going to be having a table on economic democracy, co-hosting a table. After Michael Greaney speaks, our respondent will be Dr. Thomas Walsh. He's the president of HJ International Graduate School. We're very grateful to have him as a speaker tonight. You might recall that Dr. Walsh spoke in this series earlier this year. He introduced the Rawlsian concept of social justice, which I expect will be referred to during the discussion portion of our program today. The meeting will be moderated by Bill Lay, who's also in the faculty at HJI, and I'll be helping Bill by moderating whatever we get into the conversation through the chat. This is our fourth HJI meeting on economic and social democracy. We had 2 sessions by Alan Jessen, where he introduced the basic ideas of economic democracy. We then had in February Dr. Walsh's talk on the quest of justice, where we talked quite a bit about Rawlsian social justice. And then today's meeting is a close look at understanding the Catholic view of social justice. And this area is one of 5 topic areas for Higher Purpose Forum. We have a worldview section that I've been developing over the last few years on race and providence in America, and our 4 areas of counterproposal: racial integration, this topic, justice and economic democracy. We have recently had a session of 4 meetings, a series of 4 meetings addressing the unity of science, spirituality, and religion. And we will soon, in early July, be starting a new focus on the family or the three-generation family as a basis for positive peace. We're looking forward to that. Here's our next two meetings scheduled. We have a meeting later this month in our Race and Providence in America series. That will be part two of a session, presentation on building a racially integrated society. The presenters will be Christine Edwards and Jeffrey Kingsley. And then July 2nd, we'll have our first in the series on the family and positive peace. That will be presented by Dr. Ward, who's a provost and professor at HJI, and his topic will be the pivotal role of the family in realizing world peace. I'm very excited to begin that topic area. Now I'd like to turn the meeting over to our moderator for today, Bill Lay. He'll introduce our speaker.
Myself there. Good evening, everybody. Very happy to have you here and to see you gathering, interested in this topic as we are. And I know we have a sense that social justice is an extremely important topic in America and other parts of the world. So wherever you're coming from, welcome. My job as moderator, it's my privilege to be involved in these forums. And let me just go through our terms of engagement, which you may be familiar with. Please be aware that today's participants represent a range of faiths and perspectives. Let's make sure that everyone feels welcome and included in the way we speak. Our discussion period is an important part of the program. We encourage your participation. So throughout the presentation and also the respondent, either put your questions right into the chat or jot them down or keep them in your mind. When we have the discussion, you can raise your hand and I will call on you. And we'll also work in anything that we get through the chat so that our presenter and our respondent are able to comment on it. The meeting is being recorded. And we will end no later than 8:30. And I hope we have a vigorous discussion and we go right up to that time, but we won't go beyond that time. At this time, let me tell you a little bit about both our presenter and the respondent. I'm going to go through both their bios and then I'm going to bring up our presenter. Our presenter is Michael Greeny. Michael D. Greeny is volunteer director of research for the Interfaith Center for Economic and Social Justice. That is the CESJ in Arlington, Virginia. A certified public accountant, he has audited profit and nonprofit organizations throughout the world, including the American Red Cross, Georgetown University Medical Center, and the U.S. Federal Election Commission. Mr. Greeny is co-author of The Greater Reset, Reclaiming Personal Sovereignty Under Natural Law from TAN Books, TAN Books. Other works include In Defense of Human Dignity, So Much Generosity, Easter Witness, and Economic Personalism, of which he's a co-author, along with numerous articles on expanded ownership, money and credit, history, economics, and social development. And I know you're looking forward to hearing from him on this topic of social justice. Our respondent is Dr. Thomas Walsh. Dr. Walsh is president of the HJI Graduate School of Peace and Justice Studies, HJI Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership, and he's a professor of religion and peace. He's a 1979 graduate of HJI. He earned his PhD in 1986 at Vanderbilt University School of Religion, specializing in the study of religion and ethics. Dr. Walsh has taught courses in religion, philosophy, and ethics at a number of colleges and universities, including HJI. So we'll be getting some good thoughts from Dr. Walsh as well. But having said that, let me please invite up our presenter, Michael Greeny. We're so happy to have him here. Michael, please share your thoughts with us.
Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here. That's my first thought. And I'm actually looking forward to this. Let me just, rather than stumble around trying to say something clever and witty, I'll just start off with somebody else's words and start my presentation. Let me see if I can do it here. Share screen.
Yeah, perfect.
And now where's my little thing to start the presentation? Okay. I think I just screwed up. Sorry about that. I, you're seeing everything in reverse here. It's rather like one of those science fiction movies.
There we
Very
go.
bad science. Okay, here we go. Okay. The title is, of course, Understanding the Catholic View on Social Justice. And right off the bat, I have to say it's kind of mistitled because it's not really Catholic. It's more natural law. It applies to the human person, to everybody of every faith or philosophy. It just happens to be the understanding of social justice that the Catholic Church agrees with and has adopted. And right off, then I have to qualify that by saying I am not here as an official representative of the Catholic Church, and what I say I must be taken as my own opinion and not in any way an official position of the Catholic Church. However, I am prepared to defend it, but not tonight. I'm just going to present it, and this is the framework within which CESJ understands social justice. And it's the other half, it's the Center for Economic and Social Justice. The Kelso-Adler understanding of economic justice is what you've been hearing in previous presentations from CESJ. The social justice aspect is what you're going to be hearing tonight. So that's my disclaimer and my the framework within which I'm speaking.
Very good.
Now, I've divided this into three parts. Part one is the principles of justice itself. This is the classical framework. It comes from Aristotle and modified somewhat by, not modified, I should say, explained and added to by Aquinas. Part two is when we get into social justice proper. But you can't understand social justice proper unless you understand the principles of basic individual justice. And then part three is the conclusion where I wrap up everything, hopefully, and then bring it all together. Overall, this is just a presentation of the subject. It's not a defense or an in-depth explanation, but it's basically the facts so that when you get into a big discussion on individual justice or social justice, you can say, oh, this is where CESJ is coming from. Okay, so part one, the principles of justice. Now, the very first principle the very first principle is the dignity and sovereignty of the human person under God. One of the things you'll find out, or you'll hear in tonight's discussion or presentation, is that I'm going to be using a lot of words that's colloquially most people use differently, like social justice and dignity and sovereignty. Dignity to a lot of people means you're wearing a top hat and carrying a cane down the street or some such thing. And sovereignty means absolute power that somebody has over everybody else. That is not the definition we're using tonight. Human dignity is respect for the rights accorded to each one's equal status as a human person. And one of the things you'll find out in the Thomist framework that CESJ uses is that every single human person and every single human being is a human person. And equally so is that everyone has equal rights and everyone has equal status as a human person. Now, sovereignty doesn't mean that you're ruling over everybody else. Some people actually do think that. It means supreme power and dominion over yourself, not over others. It means autonomy and freedom from outside control. When you speak of a sovereign nation, for example, you speak of one that is not under another nation's control. When you speak of a sovereign human being, you speak of another human being who is not under another's control. A slave is not sovereign. A human person, me and everyone is, of course, equally a human person, means that you are in control of your own life. Of course, that doesn't mean that children who are under the natural dominion of their parents, yes, the child is sovereign, but it can't exercise it yet. He, she, or he, I shouldn't call a child it. Now, dignity assumes sovereignty, just as sovereignty assumes dignity. They go together. Sort of like peanut butter and jelly, if you go into that. Sovereignty, as I said, does not mean anarchy or controlling others. It means controlling yourself, having dominion over yourself. And this is what virtue goes into. Now, in Catholic social teaching, and I put Catholic in quotes simply because, not because I'm trying to disparage Catholic social teaching, but to show that that's just the label I'm putting on it, because that's the institution that has promoted this particular understanding of Catholic, of social teaching. It's like saying Catholic mathematics or Catholic biology or Catholic economics. Well, it means that that's accepted by that institution. It doesn't mean that it comes from that institution. This is common to all humanity, at least in this view. Whatever your faith or philosophy, this should be acceptable to it. Now, it's based on natural law. And that means natural law being written in the hearts of all human beings. It means that it's common to everyone. It's not exclusive to a single faith or philosophy. It's discernible by human reason. In other words, if natural law was based on faith, it would apply only to that particular faith. This is applicable to the entire human race, so that it is discernible by human reason. And in fact, strangely enough, something that surprises many Catholics is that it is an article of faith that natural law is discernible by human reason. That sounds contradictory, but it does make sense when you consider human reason is the foundation of faith. Faith cannot contradict reason. It goes beyond it. If your faith and your reason are in conflict, then you have to resolve and find out why that is true, because they cannot be in conflict. Truth is a unity, whether it's a truth of faith or a truth of reason. Now, as I said, it's not based on faith, and I just hit something. Okay, and it applies to every single human person in the same way. All people, the first principle of reason is that which is true is as true and is true in the same way as everything else that is true, which means that if you're a human being, you are human in the same way and as every other human being. And you're human, let's see. Yeah, well, I think I explained it. This is one of those mental bleeps that I keep having when I'm trying to explain everything, trying to make certain I've explained everything. Now, Catholic social teaching, as does most other understandings of these things, of natural law, assumes the existence of an absolute and objective source, God. And that means that you have an absolute and objective basis for moral virtue. It's not that people get this, a lot of, especially in today's society where moral relativism seems to reign supreme, people will say, well, that's just your opinion, or that's a faith thing. Morality is faith-based. No, morality is reason-based, because God, who is the basis of all truth, is the basis of both reason and faith, so that when you have an absolute source, God, and discernible by reason, that means that you have an absolute and objective moral virtue. Now, that doesn't mean that we can discern it with our reason, because as St. Paul says in, and I forget which letter, we see things as through a glass in a dark manner. We cannot see truth clearly with our human reason because we're not God. And frankly, I don't think I'd want that job. So we can discern truth, but we have to test it. We don't see things with the absolute clarity that we would need to be absolutely certain, but we can, that's where faith comes in. Our faith helps us with our certainty. But our reason, we have to test. We have to prove it. We have to experiment until we can come to a consensus. And we must always be refining it, because we're not perfect. We're not omniscient. We have to work at reason. Now, in Catholic social teaching, the philosophy, as I said, is Aristotelian Thomist. And that has certain things. We won't get into the differences. I'm just stating this as the framework. Now, and everyone has the same capacity for virtue. I say same because a philosopher would instantly say, that's the wrong word. And I admit it's the wrong word, but it's the one we're going to use to get over this, because we don't want a 6-week lecture on the analogy of being. Analogically complete is the correct term, but just say same. I mean, virtue means humanness. Literally, it's Latin. It comes from the Latin for manness, but it's construed as humanness. Now, here's where we get a little bit technical and a little bit unnecessary, but it's necessary to the extent that faith, hope, and charity are supernatural virtues, and justice, fortitude, temperance, and the other one that I can't keep in my mind are the natural virtues. The distinction is not important for what we're talking about tonight, except that justice comes first before charity. Charity fulfills justice. It does not contradict it. If someone says, I'm not being just, I'm being charitable, and you're contradicting what justice says, you're not being either just or charitable. Charity and justice go together. They do not contradict each other. Now, justice is strictly defined as rendering to each what each is due. Now, most people will have no problem with saying that justice means rendering. What they have problems with is how you determine what is due. Now, the classical parts of justice, and this comes from Aristotle. This isn't Catholic, this isn't Protestant, this isn't Muslim, Jewish, or anything else. It's actually pagan if you want to go to that, but it's human. Commutative justice, that is the most basic form of justice. And what that means is, it's described as objective or strict justice. A debt of $5 is to be paid with $5. This is, in retributive justice, this is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You must be equal. The commutative justice is the justice of equality. It's very strict. Now, the other part of individual classical justice is distributive justice. This is proportional. For example, if I'm engaged in something like a business venture or a community and I contribute 10%, then I get 10% of the results. If it's a business venture, I get 10% of the profits, or I suffer 10% of the loss. If it's a community, and I'm not sure how they, decide how much of a percentage you've contributed to your community, I get 10% of the results of that. So that commutative justice is strict equality, and distributive justice is proportional equality. Now, and then here's where we start getting complicated. The commutative and distributive justice are particular virtues. They are very strict and very defined as to where they come. Now we get into the vague sort of virtue, the general virtue, not the particular virtue. Commutative and distributive justice are particular. Legal justice is a general justice, and it's not strictly defined. In fact, legal justice is, at least in English, the wrong word. The reason it's called legal justice, and we'll repeat this later, is because Aristotle said the way general justice is usually applied in society is by the state passing good laws and people obeying them. Well, in that sense, legal justice is particular. It's commutative and distributive. It's not a general justice. It's very particular because a law states a specific thing that you have to obey. This legal justice, the way Aristotle used the term, is not the way a lawyer would use it. It's the way a philosopher would use it. And it basically means that, in contrast to the commutative and distributive justice, which have defined acts and specific or directed objects. In other words, if I owe a debt, I owe it to somebody. I don't just owe a debt in general. And they work directly on individual good. But indirectly on the common good. Legal justice was Aristotle's concept of how the common good is affected, but it's only indirectly by the practice of other virtues. I mean, very strange concept to me. according to Aristotle, legal justice is the sense of justice that infuses all other virtues. And if that doesn't confuse you, nothing will. Now, as legal justice, it does not have a defined act or a particular object, because according to Aristotle, the common good is not a particular object. It's just a vague general welfare. And it does not work directly on anything individual. And it works only indirectly even on the common good, which Aristotle defined as general welfare. It was not a specific thing to Aristotle. Hence, that's supposed to be a picture of Aristotle. I don't really know what he looked like. In the classical system, no virtue works directly on the common good. The only thing you have is individual virtue. And this was where Stoicism, it gained a lot of adherents in the ancient world. You can't do anything about society. You can't do anything about other people. You can't do anything about anything. All you can do is attempt to be virtuous yourself. In the ancient world, the biggest competitor to Christianity was Stoicism, because that's what the pagans thought. If you want to be a virtuous pagan, you must be a Stoic and try to do the best you can and basically ignore everybody else. Whether it doesn't matter what happens to you, you have to be virtuous no matter what. That's where you get Stoicism. I'm very Stoic. I don't care what anybody's doing to me. I will be virtuous regardless of what you do or what society is doing. Now, welcome to part 2, social justice defined. We've just finished a big long dissertation on why you have individual justice in the ancient world, and in the classical system, the individual virtues are all that it matters, because that's all that they saw. And general justice was this vague sense that things should be better, and to make them better, I personally will be virtuous, but that's all I can do. Now, the social virtues, however, and these are a very recent, over the last 200 years, very recent understanding. They've always been with us, but they only started getting defined about 200 years ago. I had a big, long chunk that I cut out of this presentation to explain the history of how the social virtues came to be, and you fortunately are going to go straight into it without wondering how they came to be. Before Pius XI, who was elected in 1922, social justice was just either defined incorrectly or construed as a general justice, just a nice word for something nice. And unfortunately, this nice word got corrupted immediately by socialists and capitalists who defined social justice as redistribution. Well, redistribution, if it's done through charity, is almsgiving. And if it's done through justice, it's an injustice, actually, because how can you call it justice when it's involuntary? Or a charity if it's involuntary? You can't even call it a virtue. The one thing about virtue is it must be voluntary or it isn't virtuous. And others, as was typical with legal justice, is that they just figured that social justice is a new word for legal justice, and it means a general feeling of goodwill toward others and to the whole of society. Now, and that's why many people today still think social justice means Christian socialism. That's where you get these people who call themselves social justice warriors. We're being socially just by telling everybody else what they're doing wrong. And we want to distribute everything equally so that everybody lives a good material life. That is not what social justice means. What Pius XI did was take this term and develop a clear definition of social justice as a particular virtue, not just general do-gooderism, but something very specific. And where he got it, and this is according to Father William Ferree. Father William Ferree was a co-founder of CESJ, and what he brought to the table was Pius XI's understanding of social justice. And according to Father Ferree's analysis of Pius XI's work, social justice is a particular virtue. It is not a general virtue, and it looks directly to the common good. Now remember, what we got from the classical virtues and Aristotle is that no virtue looks directly to the common good. And yet here's Father Ferri saying that what Pius XI said was that social justice does indeed look directly to the common good. Now, to explain what Pius XI saw in Aquinas's Summa Theologica, which was a book about this thick, that most of it Aquinas didn't actually write. It came from notes from his students, which is why we sometimes have these confusing things, which was what Pius XI saw. He saw Aquinas was using the term legal justice in two ways. The same way Aristotle was, as a general indirect virtue to improve the general welfare. Two vague concepts. But then what he saw was, what Pius XI saw, was that Aquinas was using it also in a different section as a particular direct virtue to improve the common good. This is a little bit confusing because in traditional philosophy, general legal justice operates by the state passing good laws, as we said, and citizens obeying them. That's not the only way it operates, but that's the way, the usual way it operates. It operates, in general by people being individually virtuous, and this having a good effect on the whole of society. And of course, you be virtuous civilly by obeying the law, right? Now, that's assuming that the state passed good laws. Not like the Fugitive Slave Act or Prohibition or some of the other strange laws that have managed to get passed. Now, in Pius XI's thought, particular legal justice, in Aquinas' thought, I should say, particular legal justice operates by people organizing for the common good and restructuring the institutions of the common good so that people can become virtuous individually. See, we as political animals, remember Aristotle said, man is by nature a political animal, so that our natural milieu, our natural way of living is within organized social groups. So that in order to become virtuous, we have to become individually virtuous within a social setting. This is a paradox to some people because they say, well, no, you're either individual or you're social. But what political means is that you are an individual in a social setting. And that causes problems if you're trying to be virtuous, if the society is structured in a non-virtuous way. So that general legal justice, so that you have to work together to reform your institutions so that you can become virtuous. If your society is unjust, you have to make it just. Now, the problem is that general legal justice, and these are tendencies. It doesn't always work out this way, but these are tendencies. It tends to make people think of equality of results. It tends to employ coercion because remember, according to Aristotle, the way that legal justice operates is by the state passing good laws and people obeying. Well, sometimes the state doesn't pass good laws, but it coerces people to obey them anyway. And it also tends to create barriers to human development. Once you get collectivist or individualist, this is what happens. And it also tends to limit creativity and initiative. It doesn't do this by intent, but this is the way that it tends to when the collectivists or the individualists attempt to force what they see on the whole of society by citing general legal justice. Now, particular legal justice, however, is something we get very specific, but it also is tendencies. It doesn't do this by its nature. It tends to assume equality of opportunity as a principle. And it tends to use persuasion through reason rather than coercion. And it tends to lift barriers to human empowerment. Now, it doesn't always do this because it is a social thing. And you can't get everyone to go along with something unless you persuade them. So you can only speak about tendencies rather than absolute mandates. Once you start talking about persuasion, you can't have a mandate. It tends to lift barriers, except possibly moral. Once you start talking about moral, you can't talk coercion or it ceases to be moral. It tends to persuade the reason. It tends to lift barriers to human empowerment. and it tends to encourage creativity and initiative. Now, you can't order anybody to be to use their reason. You can't order anyone to live by reason. You can't order anyone to be creative and undertake initiative. But the whole idea of a particular legal justice is to structure your institutions so that these things will be optimal. Not that they will absolutely happen, but that they should happen. Now, unfortunately, when you start talking about particular legal justice and general legal justice, you're using this term legal justice for two different things. And that obviously is confusing. So what Pius XI did was he said, we will use legal justice for what Aristotle meant. When he used the term legal justice, he meant the general virtue that Aristotle was talking about that was rather vague, and social justice for the particular virtue. He's going to toss out all the things that the capitalists, the socialists, the collectivists, the individualists, and the social justice warriors used as for the term social justice. He said, we're going to use social justice in a very specific, defined way, and legal justice in a less defined way, but the way Aristotle did. So that legal justice without social justice tends to either collectivism, society is only the group, or individualism, society is only just a bunch of individuals who may or may not decide to stay together. Now, society, as we said, is made up of both individuals and groups. We are by nature political. And that means that if you're going to have general legal justice, you need particular social justice to make things work. And that means that you have a society in which individual justice and all the individual virtues address individual good, and social justice addresses the common good. Now, here's where things get interesting, because up to now, up to the time Pius XI, came through with his breakthrough, everyone considered the common good the same as general welfare. I mean, this is even in the U.S. Constitution, as we'll see in a minute. Now, that means excuse me, social justice means that people see that problems are some problems are caused by bad institutions, and that in order to correct them, we have to organize to act directly, not on the people who are acting in a wrong way, but acting directly on the institutions so that people can be empowered to act in the right way. We can't force people to act in good ways, unless, of course, they're actually trying to harm people, because that's not virtuous. What we want to do is restructure our institutions to make it the optimal thing for people to act virtuously individually. Now, so social justice does not replace individual justice or charity or any other virtue when they don't work, or they're flawed, or they're missing, or some such thing. Instead, what social justice does is make it possible for individual justice and individual charity and all the other individual virtues to work. It is not itself a replacement for individual virtue. Rather, it makes individual virtue possible. I'd use enable, but that has a very bad connotation, but I use it anyway. So that individual justice and charity work directly on individuals, but indirectly on the common good. Remember Aristotle's idea that we indirectly and generally affect the general welfare and the common good by being personally and individually virtuous. Now, social justice and charity work indirectly on individual good. See, we restructure the institutions, but institutions are indirect on their influence, so that social justice works directly on institutions which act indirectly on individuals. And social justice, contrary to legal justice, works directly on the common good, on the institutions, to provide the environment within which we can become individually and directly virtuous. I hope all this directly isn't confusing people. So I we have this schematic that I took from the book Economic Personalism, which you can download free from the CESJ website, by the way. So that here we have the efficient cause of a virtue. An individual virtue is the individual as an individual. The subject or efficient cause of a social virtue, however, is the individual as a member of a group. Now, the direct object of virtue in individual virtue is the human person. The direct object of virtue in social virtue is the common good, within which the human person subsists. And the indirect object of individual virtue is the common good. And the indirect object of social virtue is the human person. You see, it flips. Whereas in the classical framework, to say that you can have an indirect effect on the human person is ridiculous. It doesn't fit, because this indirectness is applied to society, not to human persons. You act directly on human persons. That's what virtue is all about. That's what individual virtue is all about. Social virtue is about acting directly on society, but indirectly on the human person. That will be on the test. Okay. Now, the common good, this is where things start to get a little bit clearer, I hope. The common good is not a vague general welfare. There is that aspect of the common good, but it's not the whole of it. The important part of the common good is, as I said, the general welfare is in the realm of general justice, a general virtue. The common good is this vast network of institutions that is organized social groups. We are political animals. We consciously structure our environment. No other animal does that. You could say that maybe bees do it when they construct a hive. No, they don't. They do that by instinct. We construct society by using our reason. At least I hope we do. Some of the irrational stuff that we're doing today is not reasonable. That's another whole presentation. As political animals, we are empowered through private property ownership in capital to realize our capacity to become more fully human or virtuous. Now, private property ownership is important, even in Aristotle, because this is interesting. According to Aristotle, someone who was nominally free but did not own capital was a masterless slave. And he was worse off than an actual slave who had the dignity of a master reflected on him. Now, that is, to our way of thinking, that is a very sick way of thinking, because how can you have a natural slave? How can you have someone who is a slave? But it made sense within Aristotle's limited framework. It needed Christianity and Judaism to come in, and in Islam, to come in and add this idea of, what do you mean natural slave? All human beings are equally human and human in the same way. Actually, the Romans kind of thought that too, up to a point. And they were advanced over the Greeks in that. Although don't let the Greeks hear you say that. Now, but because we're political animals, we only normally and ordinarily acquire virtue with the assistance of private property within properly structured social institutions, the polis. We're political animals, hence the polis, the Greek. Now, and private property is important. And this is how why Aristotle said that people without ownership of capital cannot be virtuous. Why? Because power naturally and necessarily follows property. That's Daniel Webster there. And he said that in 1820 when they talked about extending the vote to white males over the age of 21 who did not own a certain amount of property. Well, how can they possibly act politically when they don't own property? So Daniel Webster was against extending the franchise. What they were, the founding fathers that went at it backwards. They said we should extend the franchise to people without property, when they should have been saying we should extend property to people with the franchise. I mean, let everybody vote, but let's also make everyone an owner so that they vote properly. don't try to make them vote properly if they're not owners. And power follows property, and power is essential to virtue, because how on earth are you going to be virtuous if you cannot act virtuously? And how can you act if you don't have the power to act? So property vests people with the power to act, not at the behest of another. A slave is defined as someone who is totally at the behest of another. And you can have, Aristotle's masterless slave by people who have no power to act because they don't own anything. So they have to take the orders of people who do have property. And personally, in my way of thinking, a lot of the nuttiness that we see in today's society is going to disappear once most people own a significant amount of capital and can take control over their own life and realize their own human dignity and sovereignty.
Michael, you're doing great here, but I'm going to ask you to
Speed up.
move toward the conclusion.
Okay, actually, we're almost there. Social justice, therefore, is only by members of groups, only to the common good, enables individual virtue, and does not replace individual virtue. Now, conclusion. See, I told you I was getting there. Social justice applied. Two main points to remember. Individual justice is for individual good. Social justice is for social good. And the first principle to remember, and keep this in mind at all times, whether you're talking about individual or social justice, is the sovereignty and dignity of each human person, not any elite group or the collective. And CESJ believes that the just third way of economic personalism is the best application of social justice. You're free to disagree with that, but that's a discussion for another time. And what we call the Economic Democracy Act is the best program in which to apply it. And thank you. See, I told you I was almost finished.
Thank you.
And I end with our catchphrase, own or be owned. Okay, so let me stop the screen, stop share here. Okay.
Thank you, Michael Greeny. That was just a wonderful, very expansive and vast presentation, bringing up a lot of things. And I think, perhaps in our discussion time, we can think about what are some of those, I think you called them bad institutions that need to be changed. What kind of changes need to be made? What is natural law and good reason telling us? But I do, let's go ahead and hear from Dr. Walsh, first of all, as our designated respondent, and then we can join in a good discussion of the subject matter. So, Dr. Walsh, please step forward and give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Lay, and thank you, Michael Greeny, for that excellent presentation. And also, I want to say that I had ordered your book that you published with Dawn Brohan, who's also appeared on Higher Purpose Forum. It's entitled The Greater Reset, and haven't had a chance to really dig into it carefully, but it looks like a fantastic book and worth reading. And a number of the points that you summarized here, I think, are elaborated more fully in that book. I really like that you bring up the importance of virtue and talk about supernatural virtues, or sometimes called theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, and the natural, or sometimes called cardinal virtues, and how this, one of the areas that always interested me, and I think we were talking earlier, I did for a while study with Alistair McIntyre at Vanderbilt, who wrote an important book in the early 80s called After Virtue, and talked at that time about a kind of an impasse, not only in philosophy, but you might say in the wider society, and that impasse and the lack of an ability to create a consensus around a rational worldview was, in his estimation, due to the abandonment of the Aristotelian Thomistic synthesis of the 12th, 13th century, and was in some ways calling for a retrieval of that tradition. He ended that book talking about, well, do we need a new, for our time, how do we get out of this impasse that was not only an abstract philosophical idea that had kind of ended up in this kind of radical relativism that you refer to, or a certain view of social justice that also seems not to have a bearing in rationality, but reflects that kind of relativism coupled with a sense of certainty. And one thing that was a takeaway for me also as you spoke is the relationship between virtue and reason. And because reason is also about discernment, and virtue is about controlling aspects of our character like appetites, passions, or fears, that virtues of courage or temperance help us to manage so that we can develop good judgment, prudence, and wisdom that gives us some discernment. Now, one of the things that I want to segue into is, how do we create contexts where virtue can be cultivated? And I know this other aspect of Roman Catholic social teaching is a very great emphasis on the family, that the family indeed can provide a context for the cultivation of virtue, just as maybe for Aristotle, it would be within the polis or the city-state that had a very thick sense of shared values and ethos, that it was that context that allowed these virtues to be understood and for young people to be apprentices to the cultivation and mastery eventually of various virtues. And one theory is that we no longer have these contexts of family, neighborhood, community of shared values that would allow specific kinds of virtue and models that we look at this person who exemplifies this virtue, this virtuous life. And some of that is related to the kind of radical, multi-religious, multicultural nature of the liberal democratic society, which was how John Rawls was coming at this theory of justice, how to create kind of a political theory of justice that would allow all these different communities with their Catholic worldviews or their Jewish worldviews, their Marxist worldviews, their queer virtues, whatever you name it, would live in peace because they all subscribe to some fundamentals of a just society. So what I would kind of like to hear you say at some point, or we discuss, is because I admire this effort that you're making and the CESJ is making and resonate with it. Some of the literature I read, like First Things is a journal I enjoy reading, and there are articles there about the common good, and they're talking about, say, that even the traditional conservative movement got tied with a theory of economics, for example, under Reagan that was very market oriented. It evolved into more a libertarian view and moves away. What I think you're advocating is something more rooted in this natural law tradition. But this natural law tradition is not embraced universally. We can say that it is the best way, but part of the question is, how does the Kelso and Adler and Graney theory succeed in a society where one is just a voice among hundreds of voices, and there's a powerful system at play of money and power, where kind of transforming that system. Does it work only at the communitarian level? It could be attempted, and a model created like some of the utopian experiments here in America. But the world is so complex now. You take America, and it's got military commitments and geopolitical balance of power concerns, how to manage a very, very diverse population with radical, diverse, polarized views. So I'm not advocating hopelessness, but I'm just saying we're really up against some major challenges in moving toward the term you're using, as distinct from, say, the World Economic Forum and Mr. Schwab, Klaus Schwab, and they're calling for a great reset, but is a greater reset that does retrieve this natural law tradition. But where do we go for that, other than being a research program that might be piloted in various efforts, when it's like being a third party? It's a third way, perhaps, between the options that are out there. But as we know, setting up third parties is also up against these party machinery that's there with Democrat, Republic, and geopolitically, you've got China, you've got a real rise of authoritarian democracy, we could call it. We may not believe it's democracy. It's not liberal democracy. It's not Rawlsian democracy, but it is trending toward more the ethno-religious nationalist state. And is that an effort to find a way to create a virtuous society? Let's say with Narendra Modi in India. How do we create our Hindu civilization and extol Hindu values, and we share those values, and within our Hindu nation we can talk openly about this and refer to the great teachers of the Bhagavad Gita and etc. Or you have the Russian model of authoritarian and retrieval of the Orthodox Church, and so these are compelling to people as a kind of alternative to what some see as the decay, decadence of the multicultural, liberal, democratic society, the gross inequalities of wealth, and that you rightfully are trying to overcome. So it just generated a lot of these thoughts. And how do we, whether it's this particular greater reset that you are talking about, which emerges out of this Roman Catholic intellectual tradition, or even if we don't say Roman Catholic, natural law, Aristotelian, Thomistic kind of genealogical or intellectual genealogy at this time in history. Something has to happen in our world. We're all feeling it in different ways. Even the woke social justice part of the mix is there, and people are concerned, and that's why there's polarization also. I'll stop there. I hope I didn't go on too long. I really like the project you're working on, and look forward to digging deeper into your book written with Dawn, The Greater Reset.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the issues you raised may be answered there, or in the shorter book that we co-authored, from which we drive that Economic Personalism, which is available for free, or you can buy it and put some money in my pocket. And essentially, for the past 200 to 300 years, what you'll see, and we take this as one of the themes in the book, is that people have become disempowered. They have lost control over their own lives, and they have become victims to some of these movements that are reaching their culmination in our day and age. And I could go on for hours. In fact, the theme of the book that I'm now searching for a publisher for goes very deeply into this. And what you saw, and this is covered in Heinrich Roman's book on the natural law, which is a terrific book. You can get copies of it easily used. And it's basically moral relativism. Once people lost control of their own lives, they might, as Roman points out, everything's up for grabs. Might makes right. Whoever has the most money, the most power, determines what is right and wrong. And you can see some of the strange ideas. I don't want Elon Musk as my God. He has some pretty strange ideas. He may be a good man. He may be a great man, but he's not a God, and he's not going to dictate what morality is to me. If you want people to use their reason or their faith properly, they have to have personal power, and that means ownership, and that means reform of the money and credit system, and that means access to the means of acquiring and possessing private property and capital so that they gain power over their own lives. That's ancillary to the social justice. That's the economic justice part of what CESJ is talking about. And we can talk all the good ideas we want, but until people have the individual power to organize with others and become virtuous, it's all just going to be talk. We can't force people to become virtuous, and that's what Putin's trying to do. That's what a lot of people are trying to do throughout the world, is we're going to force people to be virtuous by our lights. Well, they're not my lights. And once we get people to be personally empowered so that they can become individually virtuous, I think you'll be amazed at just how much they'll agree rather than disagree. And you can begin again true interfaith dialogue, which is not arguing about revelation. It's arguing about natural law and how we apply it in our daily lives so that we can get along rather than fight all the time. I forget who was it said that all wars are economic. I won't go quite that far, but until we get the economics under control, we're going to keep on having wars.
And, as important as that, we just reiterate in a way that as critical as this piece of property ownership is somehow integrally related to human dignity and the ability and human flourishing at a most fundamental level. Of course, there's this wider set of requirements for the fully flourishing life of the individual and the community that needs to be added in there. And of course, we don't have time to touch on every one.
If we did, we'd be here forever.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that you responded, Michael, to Dr. Walsh's initial thoughts. And let me just say, folks, you can start, if you use the raised hand feature, I believe it creates a queue that I can follow to call upon you. So, please go ahead and raise your hand as you think of what you'd like to say. I have a number of thoughts myself. Of course, the original format of the Constitution allowed the states to determine who could vote. And generally, they allowed property owners, by which they meant land, right? Land, real property. And, in a number of states like New Jersey, if you were Black and you owned land, you could vote, way before the 15th Amendment. If you were a woman and you owned land, you could vote. That was it. You had to own land. Now, I'm not sure if you're thinking that way, Michael, land. or what it is, but they had, they did have an idea that you had to have a stake. And if you didn't have a stake, we don't want your opinion,
All capital assets.
all capital assets.
Commerce, industry, and agricultural.
A bank account. Is that enough? I mean, I can vote with a bank account. But let me hold on. I don't want to give up my microphone yet, but I will in a moment. I do have two general questions for both of you to think about. Yes, the Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be self-evident. Turns out nothing is self-evident. And there may be a natural law, but there's a tremendous difficulty in understanding what it is. And furthermore, does it evolve? I mean, or is it absolutely static, permanent, and our understanding of it evolves? Because you mentioned slavery, and we definitely have a different view of slavery than we did centuries ago. And there are other topics too. So, those are some issues I have encountered with natural law. And then let me also say, I am curious as to a bad institution that needs to be changed, and what sort of changes could we make to that bad institution? I want to name names here, and
okay. Well, the first. Oh,
go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I was going to say, first thing is, the natural law does not change. Our understanding of it changes and develops and grows as we go along. We learn. I mean, if we were omniscient, we would see the natural law. We wouldn't have to learn and grow and everything else. But, at one point, people thought slavery was a positive good. I mean, you actually can go through ancient writers and see them saying, thank God for slavery. Well, why would somebody say that who had been a former slave? Well, because it was the Roman custom. When you found a slave who you thought was doing a good job or something, it would give them money and free them, become a partner with them. I mean, do you remember the parable of the talents? Modern translations of that parable do a great disservice, because it would have been perfectly comprehensible to Jesus's audience to say, a master called in 3 slaves, and he gave them each money and said, I'm going on a trip, do with it as you will. That makes no sense to people today, but it was a custom in the ancient world. It was called the peculium. And if a slave did well with it, he would often be freed and be given the money. Very strange to our way of thinking, but to a Roman, it made perfect sense. In fact, ancient Rome sometimes had labor shortages because they freed too many slaves. Now, with the other, and I forgot what the other point was I was going to say.
A bad institution.
Bad institutions.
Yeah.
Specific bad institution. The one that pops immediately to mind is money and credit. Right now, the world is flooded with fiat currency backed by government debt. Well, if you understand what money really is, you realize that the money system was actually set up to run in a different way, to be backed with private sector hard assets, not government debt. And in fact, the government currency was supposed to be backed by private sector hard assets, and it was not even the whole of the money supply. John Maynard Keynes, among his many other crimes against humanity, assumed that currency and currency substitutes like checking accounts and saving accounts were the only form of money. I thought they used to be the smallest form of money. Money is anything that can be accepted in settlement of a debt. However you carry out business, it is defined legally in Black's Law Dictionary as all things transferred in commerce.
Michael, we can't spend too much time on this particular example.
Quick. So reformed of the money and credit system so that everyone has access to sound money rather than only the government has access to bad debt. Money it backed with its own debt is one of the reforms of the institutions we would advocate.
I particularly thank our presenter, Michael Greeny, and our respondent, Dr. Walsh, and everybody who's participating. So, Jim, final thoughts or comment?
Firstly, I'd like to thank Alan Jessen, who helped organize this program and who has introduced us to reactivate our relationship with CESJ. Certainly want to thank, of course, HJI Graduate School. And I want to mention to everybody that these programs are recorded and are being posted both on the HJI website, on the HJI YouTube channel and also on the Higher Purpose Forum YouTube channel. So those are they won't be posted right now. You'll have to wait a few days, but you will be able to see these recordings in the near future. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Bill. We learned a lot.
We
Thank you,
did.
Jim.
We
Thank
all
you,
feel
Michael.
very virtuous, even though we don't have property.
Sorry,
You and me
Arlene.
both.
Great.
Have a great evening, everybody, and see you at the next Higher Purpose Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Let's get this social justice thing straight.
Right. Thanks.